If you put two translators of the same author in a room, be it a real room or a Zoom room, will they fight? Are they sort of like hamsters in that regard? Or is peaceful coexistence possible? And maybe let's zoom in on the last sentence, forget the hamsters and the fighting translators. Is peaceful coexistence possible? What does it look like under different circumstances? What does living together mean? What does living in a place that's not really your own place mean? These are things that are worth considering, but are not the only things worth considering when you're looking at the literature, the non-fiction literature of the author Juan, which is what we're going to be doing in this episode. We're going to be looking at two recently published translations of her works, Distant Sunflower Fields and Winter Pasture, and we've got the translators of both books on the show. Pretty awesome. But before we can let the hamsters fight, so to speak, we're going to do the TrChFic news, the translated Chinese fiction news, not the Church of Fake News, despite what some people have been falsely claiming. So the first little item on the TrChFic news is kind of a sad one. The China channel, which was hosted by funded, I suppose, by the Los Angeles Review of Books, is closing up. It's just not getting any more funding grants, so they have posted a little goodbye article. It's by the editor, Alec Ash, and he's given all sorts of links at the bottom to some of their best content, basically. It's quite a little thoughtful goodbye, so there will be a link to that post in the show notes, and farewell China channel, sad to see you go. Next news item, this one is, I suppose, happier news. It's about the Vector magazine, which belongs to the British, or was launched by, or whatever, the British Science Fiction Association. And it's their 293rd issue, and it is just called Chinese SF. It's all about Chinese sci-fi, and it's got a very peculiar cover. It's a lady standing at the entrance desk of what looks like some kind, or reception desk rather, of some kind of institute. If I was better at reading calligraphic Chinese writing, I would know what this institution was, but it's kind of a very realistic. Well, it is realistic because it's a photo. Very mundane, but also slightly uncanny scene. So anyway, I'll just read you the description of this issue, because it's only a fairly long paragraph, but it hits on so many names of many people who've been on the show before, or people who are sort of friends of the show. I'll just run through it. Why not? Vector issue 293 is a collaboration with guest editors Yen Wei and Regina Kanyuwang. Yen Wei introduces the issue as well as many of its recurring concepts, such as techno-orientalism. Regina Kanyuwang takes us through the history of women writing SF in China. Artist and curator Angela Chan interviews Patrice Goulot about her work with colonial histories and the ability of science fiction to, and then in quote marks, tell truthful histories and envision just futures together through art. The conversation about history, future science fiction, and art continues in Dan Burnsmith's interview with Gordon Chung. Chinese SF scholars Mia Chen Ma, Frederica Schneider, Viersecker, and Meng Tiansun offer glimpses of their recent and ongoing research. Authors Maggie Shen King, and it says in brackets, on Excess Mail, and Chen Qiufan, Wastetide, which we've covered on the show, interview each other about their recent novels. Feng Zhang introduces us to the SF fandom in China, while Regina Kanyuwang brings us up to speed with the accelerating Chinese SF industry. Dev Argawal questions the maturity of the Chinese science fiction blockbuster, as can be judged from Shanghai Fortress and The Wandering Earth. And I'm going to insert my own opinion here. They suck. Or rather, Shanghai Fortress sucks. The Wandering Earth is fine. As in, like, 3 stars. It's fine. Continuing. Virginia L. Kong explores Sinofuturism, while Emily Xueni Jin, former guest of the show, delves into the implications of translating a growing body of SF work from Chinese into English. We learn about the global perspectives of Chinese SF from an illustrious panel assembled at Worldcon 2019, and about transnational speculative folklore of the Uyghur people from Sandra Unerman. Jumping in again here to say that's accidentally very appropriate for the episode we're doing today, funnily enough. Continuing on, Neil Harrison completes the issue with an illuminating Neil Harrison completes the issue with an illuminating survey of Chinese short SF in the 21st century. And that's kind of, I mean, that feels relevant to the podcast because so much of the sci-fi we've done is that. It's quite recent short stories. But yeah, I probably dedicated more time to this new segment than I should have. And I've not read this issue yet, but yeah, what a cool thing. Go check that out. Last news item. It's called Dingling Boiling Milk. So another text that we've covered previously on the show, actually very early on. It was Sophie's Diary, or Miss Sophia's Diary, or the Diary of Miss Sophie, or however you translate it. I guess the version we read was just called Miss Sophia's Diary. So it's very meta, because it's not just a discussion of the story. It's a posting about the story. It's about a Facebook thread, actually. I mean, it's funny, you hear so much about Twitter threads and so on. Twitter thread this, Twitter thread that, and how, if you're on Twitter, you'll often hear about how awful Facebook is. But, not everyone's on Twitter. Almost everyone's on Facebook. So, of course, some interesting things happen there. So, this is posting. It's Lucas Klein, who I believe is a sinologist or a Chinese literature scholar and a translator, I believe. And he was talking, he's shared, and well, he introduces and then shares in full a thread about a query of a translation in something in the Tanny Barlow translation of Miss Sophia's Diary. So I won't spoil what it is, actually, because it's a bit rude. It's a bit naughty, actually, which is perhaps appropriate for Sophie's Diary, sort of a naughty story. But it's a really interesting insight into not just like how translations can be sort of accidentally researched, but how people can go and dig into them decades after the original translation and learn, uncover. Lost knowledge sounds both pretentious and wrong, but he learns the origin of one little throwaway phrase in the translation with a footnote that explains it. And basically, I won't spoil what it is, but it was old Beijing slang for something naughty, which is no longer existent. It's not part of. It's not a euphemism that exists in Chinese or in Beijingese anymore. So yeah, I think I've failed at being concise and have succeeded in being very repetitive there. But it's a pretty cool thing, and the link will be in the show notes. So again, go check it out. That's the end of the TrChFic news. I will stop wasting your time reading entire blurbs and just let the interview glide on into the winter pastures and into the sunflower fields. Let's hear the discussion I had with the translators. I got a Game Boy when I was 5, so been in this for a long time.
I had the Atari.
Oh,
so
right.
That trumped everything. I mean, come on.
How old were you, though?
I was probably, maybe that age, between 5 and 10.
Okay, Jax. All right, we're all recording. So, hi, Christopher. Hi, Jack. How is it going? And what have you been up to?
Go ahead first, please.
Hi, Angus. Hi, Christopher. It is going well. Lockdown in the UK has meant that I've not actually been up to that much besides work and reading and trying to while away the time, but it's good. We've had snow here recently, so happy days.
Yeah, whereabouts are you? You're in England, right?
Yes, I'm in East Yorkshire at the moment, at my mum and dad's between flats while the country opens back up again. But it's been quite pleasant. Yeah, I've had a fortunate lockdown so far.
Yeah, we've had snow up here too in Dundee, also I guess on the East Coast. Christopher, how are you doing?
Fine, yeah. Hi, both of you. I'm in Toronto to answer that question. We've had good snow recently, actually, so it's been nice outside. I have this wee little ice rink that's built in my backyard for the boys to skate on. So that's been nice. They actually have little snow walls around it now, so they can actually push each other into the snow, which is
incredible.
Fun. Yeah, so that's been nice. But yeah, lockdown. I mean, it's been extended here in Toronto for another 2 weeks. So early March, we're hoping that there might be some restrictions lifted, but other than that, I mean, it's kind of the same. Just get at work and all these Zoom meetings and so on and so forth.
Yeah, this is a nice treat. Something slightly different, even though it's still on Zoom. It's a level up.
Yeah, I'm not your boss harassing you about stuff or anything. We're not talking business.
That's true.
Yeah, please don't start harassing us.
It's not one of these meetings that we have to sit through for 2.5, 3 hours where you don't actually say very much. You just listen to other people talk, and then it kind of goes on. And
yeah, if we did have a conversation where we never actually said anything, that would be like a death sentence for the podcast. So couldn't do that. So speaking of the podcast and harassing you guys with questions, so the two of you have very recently had something in common. In fact, someone in common. So who's that? Jack, if you want to answer first.
Yeah, of course. And I think, in my situation, it relates very much to the snow we just mentioned as well. So I recently co-translated a book by, well, not recently now, but a book by Li Juan, a Han Chinese author who lives in the northwest of China. And Christopher, I imagine more recently, you translated a different book by Li Juan.
Yeah, it's both recent and feels not recent, but I think that's because time has kind of taken on a weird hue over this last year. So I actually did it before kind of COVID hit. It was in the run up to Christmas we're in 2021, so run up a Christmas of 2019. And that was when it was kind of, I guess, more or less finished. And then of course the whole process of getting it ready and there were delays, of course. I think the original plan was for it to be out earlier. And then that kind of got scuttled as things shut down and all of that type of stuff. So it's been both kind of near and distant. And I guess that makes sense. It's distant sunflower fields. So there's the distance that's there, right? But yes, it's also by Li Juan, of course. And it's about her lived experience in the northwest of China. So it's similar. She's not a fiction writer, but I guess it's creative nonfiction because it's not solely like essays that are just descriptive or so on. They're very much narrative essays. So yeah, I kind of call it creative nonfiction, which is probably a misnomer, but that's my take on it. And it'd be interesting, Jack. I'm not sure if you can try and assign a genre label to it.
Astra House, who the publisher of mine and Yan Yan's translation, Yan Yan being the co-translator, he's the editor at Astra Quarterly, which is the publishing house's little magazine / journal that will be starting soon. They marketed it as memoir. And I think there's a strong feeling of memoir in there, but I think she does take some it's her work, so take as much creative license as she likes. But she does take maybe some creative license with facts and things like that. It's hard to know how much of a reliable narrator she is, which only makes it a more interesting story. But again, yeah, also based in the northwest of China in Xinjiang, although in a different area of the province, and written earlier than Distant Sunflower Fields. So Winter Pasture was released in the early aughts. Is that
2012?
Yeah. And then Distant Sunflower Fields is 2017, is it?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. So it's been interesting reading Distant Sunflower Fields, and I think we'll talk about this more later, but catching some of the same themes coming up and the same kind of ideas, and seeing what they're like after a few years of development.
So when I'm sorry, I know Angus is the host, but when did you translate Winter Pasture?
Oh, sorry. Similar story to you, really. So early 2019, I think now was when I submitted the original translation, and then that was for a different publishing house, which didn't quite exist at that time. It was meant to be their opening book, and this has become the opening book for Astra House, but they were under a different name and a different company. And then as they changed, the book took on changes. So Yen Yen came in and was involved. So originally it maybe had a bit more of an English feel to it, a British English feel to it. And Yen Yen came in, changed the English a little bit, also refined it a little bit. This is my first full-length translation, so it was really helpful being able to work with someone who's a bit more experienced, and we had some back and forth. And he was originally meant to be the editor, but he came on board as the translator when another editor at Astra House was given the role. So it's, as well, quite a complex kind of back and forth story, like your own. Lots of delays, but it's good to have it out soon, in 2 days.
Yeah, cool, right? That's true. 23rd, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so we should say this. We're recording this on the 21st of February, but the episode's going to be coming out a wee while later. So we've got a 5-year gap between the original Chinese editions. We've got gaps in time with the English translations, and even with this episode, we're dealing with a gap in time. So we hope you listening are feeling thoroughly confused.
Apologies, I forgot about the time travel of the internet for a second.
Yep.
Well, COVID time travel too. I mean, that's then the other aspect of it.
The COVID time tunnel. Getting back to reality, I'm going to pursue my previous line of questioning. So what sets Li Zhuan apart from other Chinese writers? I mean, we maybe have some clues in what you've already said, but what else can we say?
I think one of the aspects, I guess, that sets her apart is that she writes, it's not straight up fiction. Memoirs or creative nonfiction or whatever you wish to call it. I mean, the bulk of material that's translated into English from the Chinese tends to be fiction. So you have authors like Juan, Moyan, and that type of thing. So that sets her apart. I mean, remember with my publisher, they have kind of two sides. Sinoist is their fiction side, and ACA does the more nonfiction side. And I remember the editor initially, I had a wonderful editor I worked with, Matthew Keeler, and he said this would be ACA, not Sinoist, but it's come out with Sinoist.
Yeah.
So that's, that one of those aspects. So I think that's a distinguishing feature for her. And then I think I like her economy of language. I like her style of writing. That's what appeals to me a great deal. And I feel, at least reading it, there's that directness that you maybe don't get as much with other Chinese authors. I've worked on other translations and so on, and I find that that's one thing that stuck out to me about Li Zhuan's style, is that economy of language. And to me, I don't know, maybe this is growing up in North America, I get a feel of Ernest Hemingway from her work, and that kind of straightness, directness. The language is there, but it's really full of meaning, that you have that kind of the possibilities that come out of it. And maybe that's just a strange comparison, but I think of Hemingway's kind of not travel literature, but I mean, obviously he traveled a lot and had all of these overseas experiences, and that's incorporated into his writing. And I just had that feel with Li Zhuan. And maybe Jack will be like, wait, I don't know where that comes from, but I mean, it'd be interesting to hear your take, Jack, on what distinguishes her.
I've never thought of Hemingway reading her, but I suppose in a way, the way she uses ellipses is a very tip of the iceberg Hemingway style of writing, where a lot of her, she's very humorous in both of the books. She's a very funny writer, and a lot of, at least in Winter Pasture, and I'm starting to get the feel that it's the same in Distant Sunflower Fields, that she uses ellipses a lot to imply the punchline. And so there's a lot of kind of humor of omission there, waiting while she sets something up. And then in the Chinese, in the English, we actually removed quite a few of the ellipses, but she sets up the joke and then lets you in your own head kind of do the dum-dum. So there's definitely an economy of language in that sense. I've not thought of Hemingway in other ways with her writing. Maybe, I mean, that could be that I'm not well enough read on Hemingway.
I don't know my Hemingway that well, but it doesn't have a bit of a alcoholic tough guy reputation, and that doesn't really sound like Lee Juan.
But no, not Lee Juan herself, but certainly her mother. That
right.
comes across as this
bit of a thug.
This tough character. I mean, riding on her motorcycle through these, treacherous terrains, stripping down naked to work on the fields because it's too hot. There is the suggestion there's drinking in distant sunflower fields as well. She writes there's one part where she's hiding booze underneath their bed because they don't want to share it and things like that. So maybe that's where I got it. It's the old man in the sea right there. All you need is some bodies of water to have fun with, I suppose.
And then there is that moment when she rides into Paris on the Jeep and outs the Germans with her shotgun over her shoulder. That's a Hemingway story,
just in case anyone was getting excited.
Yeah. I mean,
that's the creative nonfiction part, remember? That's
the artistic license right there.
Yeah, I should probably say as well, this is the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast, but I do sometimes make exceptions and do poetry or a little bit of nonfiction. But one of the only other non-fictions we've had on the show was San Mao's Stories of the Sahara. And I know Lee Juan herself isn't too keen on this connection, which is fair enough. But someone with a very idiosyncratic style going out into the desert and writing memoir dispatches with a strong sort of creative inflection, I could be describing San Mao or Lee Juan there. So do you guys have any thoughts about that, especially since San Mao's Stories of the Sahara also came out pretty recently? In English, I mean.
I can appreciate the connection. It feels it was interesting to see Lee Juan speak a few weeks ago at an event that Christopher was involved in, actually. And like you said, Angus,
she doesn't like the comparison.
Disassociate herself from the comparison. And I completely understand that. I feel like their personalities are so different. Kind of the lumping of them together is, to me, seems a little bit like a publishing ploy.
Yeah, like I said, they're both quirky, but quirkiness exists in many different dimensions.
Exactly, and I think they have such different ways of looking at the world and going about their adventures. Lee Juan, in many ways, almost seems like a kind of a reluctant, sometimes with how little she's enjoying the time that she's having, at least in Winter Pasture, because it is she's there during the winter, as the title suggests, and it's harsh times. She's not always enjoying herself necessarily, whereas there is something a little bit more swashbuckling about San Mao. I do think Lee Juan's to a degree, because of its being creative nonfiction and slightly memoiristic, it does remind me of San Mao in that sense. But she also reminds me of TrChFic a little bit. Also, a very good Sanwen writer, prose essay writer. And I think even though, again, their personalities are very different, equally, if publishing houses wanted to, they could make that comparison.
I mean, I would agree with those comments for sure. And I think that the comparison is probably derived more from the publishing houses in terms of how they wish to market things. And I remember translating Maijia with Olivia Milburn, and then the publishing houses compare him to John le Carré. And I'm just kind of I don't see that comparison at all. But I guess it's a way for you to help sell books.
Yeah, there might be some other spy author who's a better fit, but what spy authors' names have currency apart from John le Carré? Probably.
Yeah.
Almost none for the general public. I guess there's another possible San Mao connection you could make, in that San Mao's living among, I guess, basically a colonized people of the desert, the Saharan people, and San Mao's among the Kazakhs, but we'll get more into that later. Here's another question about Lidron herself. We were kind of getting into this, and that's her personality. I was going to ask you, it's pretty inescapable. Like, you can't separate her personality from these books. It's yeah. And how did you guys find that trying to translate her personality into English? Jack, do you want to go first?
Okay. Is this more difficult to navigate now that there's two of us?
I had this problem. I don't know if it showed up, but in the episode with Yanga and Jeremy Tiang, it didn't occur to me I need to prompt someone to go first. Otherwise, like everyone's trying to be, no, you first, no, you first, no, you first. Or everyone's just like, I don't want to go first. And then I have to edit out the silence and keep it sounding natural. So yeah, I'm just arbitrarily picking someone. So
it's my stereotypical Canadian politeness that I'm always going to go second.
And we're from the UK. We're not much better, I think.
Yeah, there's that joke of the... Never mind, actually. Cut that bit out, please, Angus. It's a whole story otherwise.
Okay.
Apologies.
Right, so Lidron's personality and translating it. Anyone got any thoughts?
So it's interesting that you bring it up, because I think in terms of translating it, for me, the way I got the translation work was I submitted a sample after a publisher asked for samples from different translators. And the publishing house liked the sample because they liked the voice that I'd given to Lidron. And I think, but with a sample, you're only translating one short extract. And in that sample, there was one kind of particular voice that Lidron had. And it was a little bit, it was more her humorous voice. And there was a little bit of slapstick in there. And she's not just a humorous writer. There are so many layers and multiple voices to her writing that as I went along, I was maybe missing some of the other layers of her writing. And only noticed them on returning to the work later and doing later drafts and talking with Yen Yen about it. Because she really is... I mean, it was interesting to then meet her briefly online and see that how she writes is her. In real life, she was exactly kind of as I expected her to be after reading both of the books. And she writes so honestly about herself. I'm not sure how to pin down her personality, though. Christopher, do you have any kind of umbrella words?
I've been trying to kind of think of something, but I think it's that honesty that came out in the voice that I experienced in reading. I mean, it was Distant Sunflower Fields I know the rights were bought by Sinoist, and then they approached me about doing it. So I didn't do a sample or anything like that. And I remember getting into it and starting it. And then, I don't know, probably about, several chapters in, they're very short chapters to start with, but then several chapters in, I remember kind of going back and redoing all of the first ones because her voice came out in a clearer way as I got further in. And it's that humor that's there. And I think there's also this, the honesty that's there in kind of relaying what life is like and the difficulties of trying to eke out an existence there. And for me, what struck most with Distant Sunflower Seeds was the environmental commentary that's in places throughout the volume. And she talks about the waterways and how they struggle and how everybody is reliant on them. She talks about the difficulties of getting the sunflowers planted and growing. And then, you have this blanched earth and these types of things. So I think there was, that honest kind of environmental reckoning that I suppose is there.
Yeah, she pulls no punches, definitely, in terms of saying what she's seeing. I mean, she doesn't give anyone a dressing down in either of the books. She's not there to criticize necessarily, but she doesn't kind of sugarcoat anything.
No.
Whether that's her own feelings or whether that's what she's seeing unfold in front of her. And sometimes that's even just uncertainty as well, being honest about her lack of understanding of a situation. In Winter Pasture, she's spending a lot of time with Kazakhs, and she starts off treating it like a kind of anthropological, even though not a formal kind of anthropological exercise, but she's set out to try and understand the Kazakh people and how she relates to them. And at parts in the book, especially towards the end, I mean, like Distant Sunflower Seeds, the book is divided into short sections. So in one of the later sections, she kind of admits to not really having a way in, and saying, this isn't my job really. I'm a writer as opposed to kind of an academic or anything like that. And it takes a lot of courage to admit that in the book that you're writing.
Yeah.
There's a New York Times article I'm going to quote from later, but trying to figure out what's her personality, her writing ethos, reminded me of one little thing she's quoted as saying in the article. It's by Eric Abrahamson, by the way, a former guest on the show. So he quotes her having said, where are we? Yes, so she says, "My attitude has always been, don't refuse, but don't participate." And that leads me into my next question about her attitude, or her reputation that I've heard for being a little bit of a recluse or a little bit removed. And that was, while you guys were doing the translations, did you have much contact with her, or did you only get some contact or communication with her like more recently, like you were saying, over things like Zoom?
For me, it was, more recently. I didn't really have any contact with her prior to that. Some of it has to do with where she spends a lot of her time. And so there's less chance of having avenues of contact. I mean, there's sections in Distant Sunflower Fields where her mom kind of is out in the fields and trying to get to higher ground to get a mobile connection and signal and stuff like that. So I imagine there's probably challenges there. So I really didn't speak to her until we had this event a couple of weeks back and had a chance to actually hear her talk and the little speech that she did to kind of reflect on her writing. And I thought, I mean, that became one of the issues we talked about. This is the question of gender and stuff like that. And she, commentaries about why doesn't she sound or read more like a woman? And she's kind of like, well, I never really thought of that. Like, I just write. And I thought that was really an honest thing to say, like admitting I'm not an academic. I'm not here to participate. I mean, that goes back to that age-old question of ethnographical studies about the participant and the observer and all of these questions that we could probably spend an entire day on. But it was interesting for her to make that acknowledgement. I'm not an academic, I'm a writer. And then she, honestly just says, I write about what I know. And I guess that's what every writer is told to do, right? Write what you know. Yeah, I don't know what else to add there. I mean, it was wonderful speaking to her. I don't know if it would have made any difference in the translation had I spoken to her beforehand, because I think she pretty much puts everything out on the page. So I'm not sure if I would need to ask her, like, okay, what are you getting at here, type of thing? How can I better understand this? Because I think it was all there on the pages, certainly of Distant Sunflower Fields.
Same as you, Christopher. I only met her the once during the event that you were involved with Jeremy Tiang and Yenga, which Angus, whom Angus just mentioned, but not different event. Obviously, that was for your podcast. And besides that, I had a brief interaction with her via a stopgap for she had a friend read through the manuscript and kind of give a stamp of approval, but also say there were two sections I remember where we'd not quite captured the full meaning of what she was portraying. So it was helpful to have her weighed in then and direct us in the right way.
Right. So I think we've sufficiently covered Li Juan. Now let's go on to the books themselves. So on reading the blurbs, you might think they're very similar books, but like my feeling as a reader was they're pretty different. Maybe one reason would be you both have different styles as translators. Like off the top of my head, Christopher, you preserve more of the ellipses in Distant Sunflower Fields. So maybe the syntax is closer to the original syntax or something. But aside from like the differences in the translation. I think just like the setting, the characters, what exactly Li Juan's doing in the books is pretty different between the two. So my next questions are just all about differences we can point out or themes in the books and how we can compare and contrast. So first one is the idea of family. How's family present in each book? Christopher, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I mean, the certainly in Distant Sunflower Fields, the family is the unit that she's really talking about. I mean, one of the differences with Winter Pasture, I guess, would be there's a lot more discussion of her interaction with the Kazakh peoples that she's living around and with, and Distant Sunflower Fields is more about her, the land, and her immediate family with her mum and her grandmother and the uncle slash surrogate father who's not really there, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a different. That's certainly something that struck me as I was reading through Winter Pastures and stuff, and it's that different angle, I guess, that she's taken. And maybe that has to do with the 5 years in between the writing of both of them, that there's almost this element of revisiting things, but revisiting them in such a way to in Distant Sunflower Fields, certainly that kind of personal aspect, I guess, personal narrative that I feel is maybe a bit stronger. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it. I mean, both of them are really personal. I guess it's just that more her family, her mom, and her mom's kind of perseverance of trying to get these fields to actually grow. And you know, the pets, I guess should mention the 2 dogs that she has, right? The shoe stealing bigger dog, and then the small kind of mangier one that spent time with her in the flat that she had as well when she was off of the fields, and these types of things. So
and the ducks and the rabbits and the chickens
and so on and so forth. The menagerie that they live with in this, you know, hole in the ground. I think I described it once because that's kind of how she described it when they're living in the fields. So yeah, there's that element. At least that's how I found the family in Distant Sunflower Fields. It's that more immediacy of it, in the sense that it's closest to her, I suppose.
Yeah, it's like the blood relations or whatever word you'd use for it. Jack, how about family in Winter Pasture?
Quickly before I say about family, I've not reached the point in Distant Sunflower Fields yet where she described the flat that she lived in outside of the fields. I'm excited to get to that bit because there is a brief mention of it in Winter Pasture too, toward the end.
Right.
And her being snowed in that flat and kind of how she navigates going to the toilet and things like that when the toilet is, I think it's an outhouse potentially, or maybe it's because the pipes are frozen or something like that. But there's the flat features a little bit. So I'm excited to get some more stories about that flat.
Well, it's a little bit with her grandma, actually, probably mostly for the flat and the difficulties that her grandma has in losing her way. And not to give things away, but she does like markers to try and kind of figure out how to navigate around the town and stuff. And yeah, so it's neat. I won't give it away, but it's a neat experience.
So Jack,
I won't push you for spoilers. Sorry, Angus.
Yeah, you've not reached the part where her mom makes clothes for the chickens.
I don't believe so.
That's my favorite bit. That's amazing.
Okay, I'll keep my eyes peeled for that. I unfortunately couldn't put it on my Kindle, so I've had to be reading it on my computer, which is like extra slow reading for me. But like you said, Christopher, the parts are so short that you can dip in and out of it really, like little bookmarks in your day, just like slip in and have a read, and that's been really nice. But yeah, family in Winter Pasture. Sorry, slight tangent there. In a similar way, it's kind of everything in the book. But just in a different sense, in that the family that she is living with is the main cast of characters, and how they interact with each other is almost all of there isn't that much. I guess it doesn't rely on the narrative structure of like dramatic tension necessarily, the book, because it is creative nonfiction. She's not creating this kind of tragic storyline or anything like that, but
it's
they
not
are
Bajin's family, right? The family trilogy.
Exactly. She's just kind of pointing out their day-to-day, the idiosyncrasies of their day-to-day, and really weaving some fascinating stories out of that. But they are everything in the book, and like in Distant Sunflowers Fields, the family is extended. It's beyond this first family that she lives with, who are I've been calling them the Tumas, but I don't know whether they would be the Tumas or the Kumas, spelled Cuma, which was Juma in Chinese.
Right.
And in that family, there is Juma or Tuma and sister-in-law, who is Tuma's wife. And so sister-in-law is a term of endearment that Li Juan uses throughout, so Saozi. And then there's Kama, who's their daughter. And then there is Jada, who is the son and who arrives a little bit later out of school term time. And then there is so she's living with that family in their earthen burrow, which is something that the Kazakh herders live in during their time in the winter pastures, which are slightly further south than the autumn or fall pastures and spring pastures and summer pastures. And the summer pastures are right up in the Heavenly Mountains, or the Tian Shan Mountains. So there are nomadic peoples, and Li Juan has followed them to the winter pasture where they herd sheep and keep livestock. And it's this one family that I've just described, along with their neighbors who are new to joining Tuma's family this season. And that family is Xinjiang, Sina, and their daughter, young daughter, Kaligash. And then two other children who are Ramathan and Nursalash. But Nursalash is referred to as Nurgun throughout. And I'm likely butchering all of those names, so I apologize to anyone who speaks Kazakh. Those are a very Yorkshire version of all of the names. And there's Kurmash as well, who is the neighbor Shinshibek's brother. So there are quite a lot of characters. But then there's the extended family of, like in Distant Sunflower Fields, the cat, Plum Blossom, so named because of a moment of spray can
animal abuse, I think it's
abuse.
called.
Yeah, animal abuse. I was going to go spray can abuse, but it is just outright animal abuse.
The spray can was fine.
Yeah. And then Panda Dog, who is a dog with white and black patchy fur. And then also the livestock, so the camels, the cows, the sheep, goats, and horses. And a few of them kind of features star characters as well, but they have their own little sections. But
that's another difference: larger animals in winter pasture. I think most of the animals in Distant Sunflower were smaller animals.
Yeah, you're right. Yep, herd animals.
It kind of just struck me and listening. It's actually funny, Jack, listening to you, because it's a very old movie by Tian Zhuangzhuang, on the hunting ground. I don't know if you're familiar. Liachang Chasa, I think, is the Chinese name for it. But that was a pseudo documentary film about the herders up in that area, and their lived experience of moving back and forth over different areas as along with the weather, right? That nomadic experience, and that, I don't know why, you were just listening to you describe this, that kind of popped into my mind as this lived experience. It's an old film, right? It's 1980 something, I think.
Is that are they also Kazakh herders?
I'm trying to remember if they were Kazakh herders or Mongolian herders. It was a long time ago. It was, undergraduate years when you're all learning about the fifth generation directors and so on. And Tian Zhuangzhuang was one of them. And this one, I think it was talked about because the hunting of the elk is actually real in the film. So they can't put no animals were abused in this filming. It's actually, they're hunting. I mean, he did clips of it. It's a film, but it splices in documentary footage. And that was kind of Tian Zhuang's kind of call to fame at the time.
I wonder if we should take a step back here for anyone who's listening but isn't like an expert on all of China's different provinces and ethnicities.
Mhm.
So like Xinjiang, I guess probably most people listening know where Xinjiang is, but if you don't, it's like almost almost a quarter of China on the map. It's a very large area in China's northwest. And although it's, I guess, most famous for being home to the Uyghur minority, it's home to a lot of a lot of ethnic minorities who live in China, and plenty of, or at least some of them, like the Kazakhs, have a sort of a home nation. That I don't think we've explicitly said that's sort of what Li Juan is famous for as a writer, is writing of her experiences living among them, either among them like in Winter Pasture, or in an area which is, what do they call, a special autonomous county or whatever. So distant sunflower fields. Although we're with a Han author living in with her Han Chinese family, they're in a county which is designated under, I don't know, by the Chinese government as a special Kazakh area. And this leads into my next question. It's how are the Chinese Kazakhs present, and their way of life, how are they present in each book? Because I guess this is something that's come up on the show before, how especially Chinese ethnic minorities in the north often have an older way of life than than us modern people, but also the modern Han people who are living, like us, 9-to-5 jobs for a salary in a city or something like that. I mean, I say that in the era of COVID, but these are herding people, a little bit like the herding people I was talking about in the episode, oh gosh, what was it called? Last Quarter of the Moon, with Bruce Humes talking about the Evenki. They were herding people from the far northeast, and here we are in the far northwest also talking about herders. So yeah, just to restate the question, what can we say about the Kazakh people and their way of life in each book? Jack, do you want to go first?
Yes. I mean, the book gives some really detailed insights into the moment-to-moment life of the herding Kazakhs. Obviously, it's during one season, so it's set in winter, and how they go about their daily lives. I was having a conversation with Austin Werner recently, the translator of Invisible Valley, and he reminded me of a scene where sister-in-law is grilling one side of a naan bread, which is one of the foods that the Kazakhs eat. And when it's time to turn over, she kind of says, in the time it takes for the second side to cook, sister-in-law could embroider a 2-inch long yellow ram horn, and a ram horn being one of the patterns that the Kazakhs embroider on one of their many kind of textiles, which is one of their biggest kind of products, I guess. Both integral to ways of life and for selling as, I guess, cultural commodity. But just that single scene, you get such an insight into what the daily life of the Kazakhs of a Kazakh woman specifically, is like in the pastures. And there are myriad moments of that, really detailed descriptions of the particular herding practices, like how to make a whip, and she really goes into a lot of detail. But there is the oft quoted in a few reviews of Winter Pasture that have come out, and I think also on the Paper Republic site in the bio for Li Juan, she's quoted as talking about Yuhakeks Hermanbeck, who is a Kazakh writer in China, who writes in Chinese as well, and how Yuhakeks was a big inspiration to Li Juan for making her realize that she is Han Chinese, and that describing all of these sights and scenes, she's always the outsider. And I think that's a really important part of the book, that she's standing on the sidelines looking in. And so you get all of these really detailed descriptions of the Kazakhs, and you do learn a lot about the Kazakh way of life. But it is always from the perspective of an outsider, which maybe adds an extra dimension to it. I don't know. Is it different in Distant Sunflower Fields?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is it's quite different. You don't see them, or you don't encounter descriptions of Kazakhs in the sense of carving horns or the lived reality of them. There is one chapter where she talks about names, and she talks about how they've taken on, they would have the same suffix that would be given to all of them, but then they would have names like revolutionary Guli, they would have bomb and Guli, and they would have tank Guli, and all of this was because they were born in and around the period of the Cultural Revolution. And so this is the mid 1960s and stuff, and it was the spread of that revolutionary fervor and the idea of overthrowing the old and building something new, right? Out with the old and in with the new, as the idea was, and this kind of separation from the past. And so though you have all these interesting names, the only one that's missing is capitalist running dog type of thing as a name. But so it's a different experience that you have with the Kazakhs in Distant Sunflower Fields. I felt that I didn't see as much by way of description of their lived reality. But it goes back to this question of herders and stuff, and mixing between, the I guess, to use for the lack of other words, pre-modern and modern, that you have in that existence. And then it's reminded me of the description of the Mongolian peoples in Wolf Totem by Jiang Rong, and that kind of Han Chinese going up there and experiencing it. And he described, you have an older generation that still holds on to the older ways. You have this intermediate, I guess, the people born during the revolution who are embracing all of this and trying to modernize as much as possible. And then you have a younger generation that's looking a little bit more back to the past and trying to hold on to these things because they see the destruction of the modern world.
I felt like in Distant Sunflower Fields, you had to more sort of read between the lines to get a sense of what's going on with the Kazakhs and maybe their relations with the Han nation. I remember it's mentioned that Li Zhuan's father-in-law goes around taking advantage of a local custom that if a guest, or possibly a man, shows up, he has to be fed. And it's mentioned that I think we know from context, he's a bit of a shitbag, but he's just going around getting free meals off of these people who we know are Kazakhs. So there's that. And then there's maybe a more complicated character I remember. I think she's called Big Red Flower.
Yeah.
Or Great Red Flower.
Yeah, something. I think it's Great Red Flower. That's the one that she meets in the bus station, isn't it? I'm remembering correctly.
She's Kazakh, if I remember right.
Yes.
I think she's a local woman. She's a bit of a, I don't know. She's rather strange. She's Kazakh, but she always wears a very long red, I think it's red chipao, but it's also very disheveled and it doesn't really fit her. And her home's a bit of a mess, but she's one of the best farm workers. And then it's just little snippets like that where you're like, oh, this is an interesting world Li Zhuan's in. Whereas in Winter Pasture, it's really all about a Kazakh family and their way of life. And there is stuff about their interactions with like the wider nation, like things like subsidies and policies, but they're there at the front. You don't have to read between the lines.
Yeah, you've both spoken to it a little bit as well. One thing that I think becomes really apparent from Winter Pasture is the internal contradiction, or like the interplay of the two generations of it. I mean, it sounds different from from Wolf Totem that you just described a second ago, Christopher, because in Winter Pasture, the youth are very much like they have their sights set on the city and the bright lights of modern living. The bright lights of modern living, and when they return to the Winter Pasture in their school holidays, they're all dressed in new threads, which are entirely not suitable for being out herding, and they have their eyes on like Jada originally wants to be a car mechanic and then wants to fix computers, and you can see this kind of trajectory of life moving away from the older ways and the traditions which the parents are still very much living, and still very much want their children to carry on, although they're torn because there's an awareness of the opportunities that are presented by, for example, Jada going off and becoming like a computer repair person or something else to do with computers. And Kama as well, who's the daughter of the main family, a very shy young woman who spends her time on the pastures and often talks to Li Juan about, wanting a boyfriend or wanting to find a husband and missing out on a lot of opportunities to do this because she's in the pastures. And she's not in the local town or village, which, even though that local town or village isn't a big modern city, it's still relative to what the life they're living in the pastures, a much more, I guess, modern existence.
If I was going to contrast it with Wolf Totem, I would say Wolf Totem is very transparently this Han guy projecting what he wants to see onto the Mongols.
Very much so.
You can see that most when he's trying to parallel the strength and vigor or whatever he's seeing in the Mongols with people from, the Germanic people of Europe or something. He said, well, they all eat cheese and that's how they conquered the world. And it's like, did you go in thinking that before you started writing? I think you did. Whereas Li Juan...
About goat cheese.
Yeah.
That's the secret.
The fuel of empires.
That's the answer to history. It's the dairy products. But yeah, I got the sense that Li Juan was just taking what she saw and either writing about it or writing about her own inner life and her family and her thoughts. One doesn't really get the sense there's an agenda or there's blinkers on her eyes.
Yeah, no, for sure. I didn't mean to imply that whatsoever. Wolf Totem is very transparent. And this idea of the wolf versus the dragon, right? And that the Chinese nation should abandon the dragon, which is this slithery, snakish type of character, and embrace the wolf. I mean, he's got a politics that's there. And that's the difference with Li Juan, I think, is that she's just simply describing the lived experience that's there in these areas. And that's really, I thought it was the chapter about them being named after these revolutionary terms. I thought it was hilarious. It's very humorous. And it reminded me of this Hong Kong University press book about Chinese English in the 50s and 60s, of how they taught English at that time. And you have these primers that are going through like all of these revolutionary terms. And then, you'd have these stories about how the evil West was this, and how you have the Soviet Union is that. And of course, then they become revisionists and so on. And it was neat listening to the use of those words and that kind of naming filter into these people's very far removed from all of this, right? I mean, of what was happening in the cities during the Cultural Revolution and so on. And you get these snippets that filter out into the Northwest. So you have, somebody's called revolutionary. Like, you're kind of like, what? How does that work as a name? But I mean, it was humorous to see that. And I think that's the honesty that shows through with Li Juan, without the kind of political infrastructure that Jiang Rong certainly had for Wolf Totem.
I see the clock is moving forward, as clocks tend to do. So I'm going to keep us moving forward. Move on to the section I've titled Slightly More Vast Questions. So the first one, this is probably the elephant in the room. I've kind of hinted at it before. So I'll start by going through the dates, because that's pretty important. But yeah, the dates, publication dates. So Winter Pasture came out in the original Chinese in 2012. Distant Sunflower Fields, 5 years later in 2017. And 2017/18, there were reports in the media, so you can go online and read articles about Chinese Kazakhs being sent to camps. So these are what are they called? The mass incarceration, mass internment
camps.
Mass internment, that's the word I'm looking for. The mass internment camps that we've heard about in Xinjiang, where not just the Uyghur ethnic minority, but all the sort of Muslim ethnic minorities from Xinjiang, the Kazakhs included, seem to be being sent to in very large numbers. And the stories were in 2017-18 that reports of these were coming out. Chinese Kazakhs were going to the Kazakhstani government for help, and the Kazakhstan government was denying their existence. In 2019, the Chinese government allowed 2,000 ethnic Kazakhs to renounce their Chinese citizenship and repatriate to Kazakhstan. We have a story as well that, had the years been different, might have been worryingly relevant to winter pasture, but it's worth mentioning. So in 2018, the Chinese government launched a program whose English name would be something like Pair Up and Become Family, where Han Chinese cadres, so like government officials or government-related people, were going to live with Muslim Chinese families. And I guess anyone who watches China news, you regularly see these sort of upsetting, I guess, stories coming out of Xinjiang. So I think we have to kind of deal with this stuff somehow, talking about Li Zhuan's books. But I just want to say to the listeners, we're not trying to cast any aspersions on Li Zhuan or say there's anything sinister going on in her writing. Like we said, she seems to be the opposite, a really genuine, gentle, I think, person. But she is a Han Chinese person. She lives in Xinjiang, today's Xinjiang, and that's what her writing is kind of about, living among the Kazakhs. So we can't ignore the question. But do either of you have any thoughts about this, about the broader, what's going on today?
I mean, it's interesting, if I'm okay to jump in. All of this is post winter pasture that you've kind of just cited.
Yes.
But there is a flavor of this in winter pasture already, which Li Zhuan kind of skirts around, I don't think for any reason, it's no malicious reason. She's not trying to disguise kind of this policy that is talked about in the book, but I think out of a certain necessity, perhaps for herself as a writer in China, although I don't want to speak for Li Zhuan, of course, but you do. She alludes to something in the book that it's never stated explicitly, and I think some people might question, especially with all of the news that you've kind of just talked about now, Angus, why is this never stated explicitly? And I don't think she needs to, or at least I think the way that she deals with it, she makes it very apparent kind of what is happening without putting her own foot in it, in a sense. So there's a policy that's going on, and I should have looked up beforehand what it's called, but there is a land reclamation policy that's being rolled out, and it's about trying to place the nomadic Kazakhs in these allocated lands for them to farm and keep their livestock there. And these are along the Alunga River, which features in both of the books, and they're away from these vast plains where for millennia the Kazakhs have been migrating and living their life of transhumance and undisturbed, and they've been doing it in a way that the reason that they rotate and they travel, besides staying within weather that is bearable, is to give the grass and the crops time to regrow. And then all of a sudden there is this policy of land reclamation, the reason for this policy being to give the grass, which has now been eaten to close to death, a time to grow. And this is a government enacted policy. And there is some discussion between different Kazakhs about how they feel about it and their excitement of, having a stable life for some of them, and others feeling like it's a change that they maybe don't want. And Li Zhuan herself never says either way which she thinks is better. But I think there's a certain point where she really clearly juxtaposes this discussion of how old this tradition of nomadism is, and nomad farming, with saying, and now after millennia, the land has had too much and we must take it back in order to give an opportunity for it to regrow, while the Kazakhs are put in this land where they'll have to fertilize and they'll have to modernize their farming methods. So while none of the above that you talked about, Angus, is going on at the time, I think there are definite nods to this trend already taking place, a quite frightening trend, and it's obviously only become much, much worse. But obviously, go on, sorry.
I was just going to say, if we think about when she's writing these and then when they actually are published. So, I mean, in terms of our translations, it took a year probably for our translations to get out. So we can probably think the same thing with her. So if it's 2012, she probably wrote it, 2010 before it finally came out. And so, again, she's a little bit more removed from it. And 2017 for Distant Sunflower Fields is probably 2015. So, again, it's before things, I guess, blow up, certainly in the international media. There's the long process of these things starting to happen. I mean, for me, the being back in North America, for me, they sound like reservations for First Nations peoples and these types of things. And in a Canadian context, the re-education camps, internment camps, whatever you want to call them, sounds, again, for Canadian, it's the schools that the government built in the 1960s and basically separated First Nations peoples from families and sent them off to these schools to learn English and be beaten for speaking your own language and so on, the residential schools as they were called in Canada. And right now here at the University of Toronto, where I'm at now, every meeting and every kind of policy always comes with a land acknowledgement, that there is a recognition that these lands that the university is on, that those of us who are of settler heritage, that this land is not ours, that this is land that belongs to the Algonquin peoples or the other First Nations that once inhabited these areas and still inhabit them, and so on. And it was interesting when I was translating Distant Sunflower Fields, because it's not a lot in Distant Sunflower Fields, this discussion about these larger issues related to the Kazakh people and so on. But as Angus said, it's the elephant in the room. It's there in the background, and there's the issue of the changing of the landscape and stuff. But I think in all of that this idea that it's the Kazakhs that have overherded or overused the land, and thus they need to be put one side in order for the land to be rehabilitated is probably the great lie that's perpetuated, right? That by the central power, that they have to come in and take control of things, because if we let the locals manage things, they're just going to run it further into the ground. And I find in reading Distant Sunflower Fields, Li Juan doesn't bring all of that politics in. At least I don't see it in there, and that's, I don't know. I don't think it's a deliberate choice. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this. I think she's tried to, certainly for Distant Sunflower Fields, is to keep it on that individual experience. And I think that's what's probably sometimes missed in all of these big discussions, that Western media is very content to paint everything the same color with one big brush, and this is how it is. And the Chinese do the same thing with, whether it's CCTV, and they're saying this is how it is. And it kind of overlooks the individual lived experiences. And I think that's where Li Juan,
the kind of Westerner or Western reader who's like, well, Li Juan didn't reveal and denounce the entire Xinjiang and PRC government, therefore can't be bothered with her. That attitude I can't stand, because it's like, what on earth do you expect? You can't expect every writer to be a dissident writer. You can't expect people to throw their life and their family's lives away.
Not everyone is Solzhenitsyn, right? And so on.
Exactly, yeah. I was watching just last night one of the episodes in the new Adam Curtis series, I Can't Get You Out of My Head, which goes through British political history, American, Russian, and Chinese this time. I think it's the first time he's touched on China. And they had a clip from an interview I've seen bits of before, where it's in the late 80s. I think it's the run-up to Tiananmen, where a BBC journalist is interviewing a Xinhua journalist, and he's basically grilling him on democracy, freedom, rights, and so on. And the Xinhua guy, I don't know, the vibe I get from him, he's just trying to do his job, so he's trying to give as good as he gets. But like the BBC journalist says something like, "Are you free to report whatever you want?" or something, and the Xinhua journalist says, "I think I need to go to do something," and he just gets up and leaves the room. And my girlfriend was watching that with me, and she goes, "Ridiculous," and I was like, "Well, the system is ridiculous. The man, what was he going to do? Like, what can we expect of someone who's part of the system who doesn't want to go to jail?"
I think this is generally a problem that has seeped into what Chinese literature is published in translation as well, and what publishers are attracted to because they think that audiences will buy, readers will want to find out about a lot of this kind of fetishization of the woes of the Chinese people and of its history and the sufferings, and it's kind of like it's like tragedy porn in a way. A lot of the publishing angle for Chinese literature in translation, and I mean it's refreshing to not have that with Lijuan, even though I do think these are topics that need to be discussed, but it's refreshing to not have to have that kind of vibe.
Yeah, I mean, it was once upon a time. It was if it wasn't dissident literature, then it's not literature, right? It's got to be adversarial. It's got to be orientated around protest and so on, and that's something that seemed to be less of a concern maybe 10 years ago. I was speaking recently with Jeffrey Wasserstrom from University of California, and he was talking about these issues, and he's written a lot on Hong Kong and the protests there and so on and so forth. And he made this note that it was probably around the 2010 when things started to change more to the greater restrictions and stuff. And prior to that, you could have all of this other different kinds of literature coming from China, and then now it's got to be dissident literature again. That because the politics of contemporary China, it's got to be dissident or it's nothing.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
And it's interesting and it's refreshing that Lijuan doesn't necessarily fit into that category. And you're right, Jack. I mean, these are issues that need to be discussed. But I think that painting them in big brushes, all one color, is not the way to discuss them.
Definitely.
Like, that's the problem, is that everybody just wants to say this is bad and so on. But it's a much more nuanced type of situation that bears much more discussion than probably we can do here.
My feeling, this is a pet theory, and after I'm done this, I'm just going to zip us on to the next question so that we're not here forever. It's that, like, after the Cultural Revolution, there was some leave for a whole wave of authors to write criticism of basically communist policies or calamities in the PRC and not just things that came before it. And those writers are maybe still able to write some books like that, but they're getting older and older and older. So for younger Chinese writers that Western or English language publishers are looking to translate, it seems like the more interesting, and this is just maybe my biased perspective, but the more interesting stuff now is maybe in genre fiction, or maybe it's in Lijuan, people writing about aspects of life that aren't political. Because even in China, there's plenty of life that politics doesn't touch that would still be interesting to talk about.
I mean, for me, Yan Liangke is the only one that gets away with it really still.
Right.
And very barefaced about it as well. He's in the Writers Association. He's high up. He's of a high stature. But I mean, there's so much interesting literature coming out of China that isn't just political, and not even just genre stuff as well. There is literary writing. I mean, I don't want to make that distinction too heavily. There is genre and there's literary, and it's nothing to do with politics.
There's stuff with magic and robots, and there's stuff about no magic, no robots.
That's a better distinction.
Well, just before moving on, though, I think that's a really good point that probably should be stressed, that those who came out in the 80s and into the early 90s and stuff like that, who were able to push the boundaries as much, they have the reputation and the connections that they can be more protected
Yep.
than younger authors, certainly women authors, that maybe don't have the same types of protection. So they have to navigate a different terrain when it comes to what they write and how they get things published, that people like Yan Lianke and Jia Pinghua and these older guys who, I think the PRC government is probably aware enough that shutting them down too much will turn martyrs out of them, will turn them into martyrs, and that'll make things even more problematic for them. So it's the younger authors that face the brunt.
I get the sense that there's a sort of a rebellious but not too rebellious boys club, and it's all of a like you said, that generation has had their journey up through the rank and file of the Writers Association, but the avenue they took is now closed. So unless something changes, they won't be replaced by an equally rebellious but not too rebellious group. That sort of leads us on to the next question. So I'm going back to this New York Times article I said I was going to quote from, because it kind of talks about Li Juan's place in the sort of literary establishment. So I'm going to start. This is a fairly long excerpt, by the way, so here's hoping my voice doesn't crack. Starts here. In highly socialized China, it is hard to imagine any writer being truly antisocial in the sense of being both disconnected from society and, when necessary, downright offensive. Some of the country's greatest literary figures, the poet Li Po, the novelist Tao Xueqin, were outcasts, but not by choice. They had been exiled or ignored. Yan Lianke represents one model of resistance, but it is a model that very few writers can follow. Though many of his books have been unpublishable inside China, he retains an uneasy place within the system. His talent cannot be ignored, but his insistence on writing about politically sensitive subjects means that his peers view him with embarrassment. He's almost alone. Even his family wishes he would stop. Then there is Li Juan, who may be as far outside the system as Chinese writers are able to get and still publish. She lives and writes in the Altai region of Xinjiang in Western China, musing on nomadic lifestyles and the turning of the seasons. Her literary career has taken what she calls the wild path, wild being traditionally used in Chinese to refer to things outside the establishment. Am I going to keep going? Yeah, I'm going to keep going. She isn't defiant or high-handed. Instead, she seems shy and is given to giggling in public. After a decade of writing in poverty, pitching to magazines and publishing houses, the strength of her writing gradually gained recognition. The success of my writing relies to a certain extent on promotion by mainstream literary circles, she wrote in an email, so I can't claim to be isolated from them, but my attitude has always been, don't refuse, but don't participate. Despite her growing reputation, Li Juan claims to be hopeless at self-promotion. I don't know how to do anything but write. She has little contact with anyone in the literary establishment beside the editors who publish her work. Some colleagues think I'm giving myself airs, but there have been some senior figures who've been willing to speak up for me, and I have to thank them. Li Juan is unfailingly polite, almost self-effacing, except when conversation turns to the craft of writing. Evaluating her own and others' words, Li Juan turns hard and displays a fixation that calls to mind Yan Lianke's stubborn revisiting of historical subjects. Whatever quality this is, strength of character, disregard for the opinions of others, it is the closest thing China's literary scene has got these days to the spirit of dissent. And I think that's pretty cool, because we'd stressed before that Li Juan's a fairly gentle character, but we hadn't mentioned, I guess the only time we made her sound tough was when we said how strongly she says that she's not Sanmao. But yeah, okay, I see Christopher's vanished.
No, I'm still here.
Okay.
I'm busy looking for the charging cord for my laptop that I stupidly forgot to get initially. It's one of the things I keep doing, and I keep telling myself, you really should make sure you have your power cord, and then I don't. So no, I've got it now. So I'm just returning to my seat. I kept my thing on so that I could continue to listen. I just turned off the video so you don't get vertigo watching me wander around looking for power.
Right. Jack, I'll point this question to you first then. I guess we're not in the Chinese literary scene, so we might just be speculating here, but do you have any thoughts about what Eric Abrahamson's writing about there?
I do. I don't know how how people should take them with a pinch of salt, I guess, for the very same reason that you just said. When I'm not inside the Chinese literary scene myself in a direct sense. I mean, it's definitely worth noting that for Li Juan to have attained the stature that she has within Chinese literature and the popularity she has in China, without being a member of a writers' association, is very impressive. And I hope people will correct me if this is wrong, but I don't know if there are any other writers at the moment that have achieved that. I would love to know who, if there are.
Han Han is kind of an interesting guy. Do you know much about Han Han?
Not really. Embarrassing there. Maybe I shouldn't admit that.
He's probably about as opposite personality as you can get, but I think he got his break publishing stuff online. I don't think he's anywhere close to the the League of Writers. But he made himself famous, and now he's I don't know how much he writes, but he's got this website called Iga, or One is its English name, and it's sort of like an online platform for writers. So although he's sort of like a bad boy, I did do one story from originally published on Iga on this show. It was Song actually, funnily enough, a Chinese Muslim writer, Song Aman's short story, Gongsun's Dreams, and that just read like literary, slightly weird fiction. So that's a guy who's built some kind of an alternative name for himself on platform, but he sort of did it through crass means, I guess, or at least that's where he got his start from. Whereas Li Juan isn't, she's not loading her books up with bad boy antics and sex and stuff. That's playing any cheap tricks.
No.
Song Aman is wonderful. There's a story of hers on Paper Republic, I believe, translated by Michelle Dieter, which is brilliant. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the internet, because perhaps Wangluo Wenxue, perhaps internet writers are the only. I mean, they are a big population, and they are outside of that central society of writers. Perhaps they're the only ones. Obviously, Li Juan doesn't fit into that category, and she's not necessarily writing the same things as them. I mean, have you got any thoughts about that, Christopher? Now, I do have something else I want to say, but you go in.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's interesting you bring up authors like Han Han who get their start on the internet and the internet literature and stuff. And for me, I'm not a very big reader of Han Han either. It's an updated version of Pizza Wenxue that Wang Shuo wrote. I mean, hooligan literature. That's what I find. That's the category I would put it into. I think the internet allows you that leeway, at least to some extent, and kind of to operate outside of the literary associations, which are enormously powerful. But my eyes were averted because I just actually got a copy. This was published in 2017. But David Wong, a very well-known Chinese literary historian at Harvard, he published the new, what was it called? I'm looking it up again now, the title. It's like this big 1,000-page edited volume, a new literary history of modern China that came out in 2017. And this is kind of a sequel to C.T. Xia's Modern Chinese Literature, the History of Modern Chinese Literature, which, of course, most people would be familiar with. And in it, there's actually a translation of a short essay by Li Juan as part of this new literary history of China. I will admit I haven't read it yet because I think it comes on page 800 and something of this 1,000-page book. But it's suddenly coming into my own, translated by Kyle Chernook. And it's a short little essay about, and it was published in 2007. So it's interesting when you think of Li Juan operating outside of the writers' associations and stuff. But it's obviously, her profile obviously has kind of been noticed beyond those structures of kind of control in the literary domain in China, and the Wentan experience and how that works and so on. So it's fascinating.
2007 is a while ago now.
Yeah, it's a while ago now. But it's. I think that the New York Times article, I mean, that she's operated kind of outside on these margins of things.
Yeah, that article is from 2015, so that's quite a while ago too. I mean, I hate to say it, but
so it's interesting. I mean, when you think about all of these, the complex matrix that operates and how influence gets kind of spread around, and who gets acknowledged and who doesn't, and where they get acknowledged, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's another podcast right there, right? At least
there is an, in terms of Li Juan's distance from it all. There is an interview somewhere online, perhaps on YouTube, probably from around a similar time to the New York Times article, maybe a year or two before that. So not that similar. A lot can happen in 2 years, where she's talking about her own reading.
Oh, very true.
Case in point, this past 2 years. She's talking about her reading habits, and I can't remember specifically the books that she says she reads, but she definitely distances herself from a lot of contemporary literature. She basically says that she doesn't actually read that much, and what she does read is not to do with the current literary scene. So seems quite happy to kind of remove herself from that.
Yeah, respect. Good for her. Here is a question about you guys, basically, and it's going back to the Kazakh people and Xinjiang as well. So did either of you, and I kind of know the answer here, but did either of you have to go sort of above and beyond what a normal Chinese to English translator would do, coming up against sounds a bit oppositional, but encountering words in Chinese which are translations themselves from Kazakh that other translators wouldn't bump into? And if you did, how did you handle them? Christopher, do you want to go first?
I mean, I've mentioned it before. It was probably the only biggest challenge was the names of certain places, right, and then certain peoples. I had to go in and look up. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of it. The Bekia Hamet is one of the names that's kind of used for a lot of the characters in this chapter, and then afterwards whenever they pop up. So that was trying to find the right Romanized form, because we're not writing it in Cyrillic, and we're not going to use pinyin, because I don't think that would be the appropriate way of doing it. Just pinyin, use the Chinese form of the phonetic alphabet for it. So I looked that up to try and figure out how to get it. And I think the Y has this like underspace that the line goes just through the little bit of the Y. But thankfully the publisher was happy doing the unusual script with it. So that was great. But I mean, beyond that, there wasn't much by way of difficulties other than kind of geographical names and trying to find the right form in the Roman alphabet. That was probably the biggest challenge. But
three cheers for fonts that use Unicode and can incorporate thousands and thousands of different alphabets. Yeah,
well, I mean, because once upon a time they wouldn't, right? They would want it anglicized as much as possible, type of thing. So it was nice that we didn't have to do that. So it does kind of stay as close to it. And I think using pinyin wouldn't have been correct either, for these Kazakh speakers and stuff. I mean, there's mention made a couple of times in the book about the Kazakh young herders who don't speak Chinese very well, and I think that's fine, right? There's no reason that they should necessarily. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Okay, and Jack.
I mean, Yan and I came up against similar problems in the sense of the names, for both the characters and the places, and transliterating them from Chinese into a kind of some Romanized form, or even into the Kazakh form was difficult just using Google. So I contacted around through, I can't remember exactly how I managed to get in touch with him now, but a Chinese to Kazakh translator called Altenbek Gula, who is credited in the front of the book. And we had some back and forth where I'd sent him any Kazakh phrase in a long list, and he gave me and some context as well where it was necessary, and he gave me the Kazakh spellings of them, the Romanized Kazakh spellings, so not the Cyrillic spellings. And unfortunately, there are a few examples where some of the words have, for example, an I. I don't know, I'm unsure what the name of this letter is, but an I without any dot on top of it, and that kind of thing. And so those unfortunately aren't in the book, but I'm not sure whether, an English reader would necessarily know I don't know what the difference in the pronunciation between the two is, even talking with Altenbeck, and I couldn't pull it off. So there are some maybe slightly more Romanized forms of certain words, but there's a glossary in the back of the book with lots of Kazakh words. So there was lots of, I was thinking when you were talking about the documentary earlier, the On the Hunting Ground, it's like, where were you when I was translating this book, so I could know about this documentary and watch it and get kind of a visualization of a lot of the things that were being described. It meant, the translation meant a lot of Googling and trying various combinations of search phrases to hope that you land upon the right thing, and then double checking it back with Altenbeck. But it also meant looking at lots of beautiful pictures of rugs and searching wildly for the specific winter burrow and what it looks like, so that we can get the description right. It was really good. I learned a lot about a culture that I was really quite ignorant about, to be honest. Lots about food, but lots of food and cultural phrases that they're all listed in the glossary at the back. And I believe there's only one Chinese word in the glossary, which is zongzi, and the rest are all Kazakh words.
Yeah, Winter Pastures, I think, has a greater volume of these types of phrases and stuff than Distant Sunflower. That's what struck me most when reading your translation of it, and that's what I was like, that's a difference there, certainly between the two volumes, for sure.
It was quite a challenge. Oops, sorry, go on.
Google and Baidu, I would go through and then kind of double check things, and then you'd go and stumble around, and I would fall into these rabbit holes from time to time.
Yeah.
Not get very much translating done because I'm busy looking up, and I'm like, wow, that actually is really kind of neat. Let's click this link and that link, and then the internet rabbit hole, and I realize it's dinner time, and I'm like, oh, I better stop.
So excellent work today. 10 words translated. Brilliant. But I know a lot more about camels or something. I have an anecdote, something not a million miles different. So there was a book, another non-fiction Chinese to English book in translation, which I was typesetting and doing production for as part of my job. And it involves a map of the country about a Chinese man who walked the entire perimeter of the Chinese border through all basically the non-Han areas, more or less, with some exceptions like the East Coast. So like Tibet, the Uyghur and the Kazakh parts of Xinjiang, lots of Mongol places, I guess Manchurian places. And how we did the map, we received the map from the Chinese publishers, and I just had to go into Photoshop and recaption all the Chinese captions, which are of course all in Chinese. So not every single one, but if I was trying to compliment myself, I would say conscientious. If I was trying to belittle myself, I'd say a little bit anal retentive. But I wanted to decide for everyone, should I use the Chinese pinyin or should I source it back to the original? And some of these regions, you don't even know which language you should be going back to, or the best way to find out is to look on the map and find out the name of the county and see if it's assigned as one autonomous county for a particular ethnicity. And yeah, it was a great source of fun. It was fun, yeah. So many rabbit holes. And
well, of course, because the map itself is not a Chinese map, it's a Manchu Qing China map.
Right.
That's, present day map is the legacy of the Qing Empire, right?
Right.
I remember living in Taiwan years ago, and there was an elementary school, and they had their map. Actually, Mongolia didn't exist. It was all of the old style Qing map when you had no Mongolia whatsoever, and it would go down. I think you had maybe South Vietnam, and that's it. It was one of those types of maps. So it must have been, rabbit holes.
It's important to dream big.
Plenty, I think.
You know?
Was it a struggle to fit in the in some of the names? Because obviously moving from Chinese so small to fitting on a full name on a map when you're going off the same size must have been a challenge.
Yeah, line breaks for my friend. Yep.
Yeah.
The second dimension height. Okay, so moving on, another geographic question. And we did have to, full disclaimer, we did have to rephrase this one because it started off very vague. But the question goes something like this. Do you guys have any thoughts on Western China and the Stans, Central Asia, both like in the literary or cultural imagination, either in China, the West, or internationally? And do you think there's anything we can say about the frontiers of Xinjiang when compared to the other frontiers that China, or borderlands that China has? So like we mentioned before, the Mongols are also herding, or some of the Mongols are herding people, and some of those herding Mongols live inside China, similar to how the Kazakhs do. Is there anything interesting we can say about those in relation to Li Zhuan's two books? Anyone want to go first?
I need to think first.
I kind of didn't ask that very directly. So how about this? The setting, how this setting exists in the literary imagination. Like, I guess the only reference point your average Westerner might have would be the Silk Road or the Gobi Desert. But I grew up thinking the Gobi Desert was in Africa. So
that's an interesting insight.
Yeah, welcome to my mind.
Or Marco Polo, right? I mean, that's where Marco Polo reached, probably the Stan countries. He didn't get any further than that. Although don't tell Italians, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a complicated relationship, I think, and that's the legacy of empire. I mean, to me, the Qing Empire encompassed all of this because they saw these peoples as kindred spirits. They were nomadic warrior tribes and so on, and all the various khanates that you had throughout, what was once Mongolian territory, and so on, and the influx of Islam that kind of unites them as a religious polity, I suppose, without the sense of nation state borders that you have now. That and the Qing Empire was ecumenical, I guess. It was welcoming of religious diversities and so on, and that allowed these places to flourish as part of this long kind of expansive empire. But it was an empire that these places were conquered. They didn't voluntarily join. And to go back to an earlier part we mentioned about the Kazakh people being given the opportunity to be repatriated. Repatriated to what? Because these borders are all arbitrary. I mean, where they live is where they've always lived in that sense, and where they've had their nomadic existence has been in the same place. So the various Stan countries that are there now are arbitrary constructs of Soviet times, actually. Right. So you've even got the legacy of the Soviet Union at work here as well. And what used to be, I mean, we could go back, right, to the big game between the British Empire and the Tsarist Empire, that they were also fighting over these areas, right, with what's his name, Youngblood, I think is the British fellow who fought his way to Lhasa in 1905, and so on, and the Russians who were there trying to fight against them, but do it through proxy. So it's the geographical terrain. I mean, it's hard to get your head around because it is such a complicated thing, and the nation state borders that you have now as this legacy of the Westphalian system is entirely arbitrary, and a form of nationalism that's born upon this idea of Heimat, right? To use the German phrase for it, the one land, one people, one language. is incredibly arbitrary. And that's, I'm going off on it's a huge tangent here. But it's, yeah, I don't know how the various stand countries factor into Li Jian's work itself.
Yeah. I think what you're saying, like the whole gaps in our ability, your average person's ability to understand the fluidity of these places, like going back to what I knew before I knew anything about China, I kind of thought of my idea of Asia was, right, there's the Middle East, there's India, there's China and all those very far eastern countries, there's Russia. That's it. I didn't really know what the term Central Asia meant until I was living in a country which is technically part of Central Asia. China has some of Central Asia, like Xinjiang, and some of Tibet, I guess you could call Central Asia. So yeah, but you're right. It's like the history is crazy. It's really interesting history. But yeah, it's only there. I don't know. It's not really there in the two books. But like when I was reading Winter Pasture, and we're living with this family of the Kazakh family, and they're like pretty ordinary people. They have flaws. They have wonderful sides to them. They do smart things. They do stupid things. And I was like, right. And the only things I've read about Kazakhs before this were about their epic role in Central Asian and sometimes Chinese history. And then before that, my only exposure to Kazakhstan was a movie called Borat, which is not really about Kazakhstan at all.
It's true.
They're good ice hockey players.
All right.
There's the team Kazakhstan is actually a decent hockey team. But of course, that's the legacy of Soviets.
Right.
That's the Red Army team.
I mean, for Red Dust is the only other Chinese book I can think where there's modern Chinese book where there's a lot of exploring of those areas. I mean, again, from an external perspective, but someone who definitely isn't trying to sell any political perspective or kind of insinuate any Chineseness upon the places that he's visiting. So is that the Ma Jian book, Red Dust?
Yeah, that's Ma Jian.
And I mean, as shallow as these things are to say in terms of the discussion, both that and the Li Juan books may have made me want to visit these areas and see, like, even though like Dunhuang is I think it's in Gansu maybe and not in Xinjiang.
I think so.
But also just how much Gansu and then Xinjiang as well are kind of have historically been cultural nexuses for so much, for so many different cultures, is fascinating. I did quite a bit of translation about art and medicine moving along the Silk Road, and just what's gone on there, and what has borne out of there or mixed there and thus kind of like exploded out of it. It's a wild history, and something that probably should explore a little bit more myself. I mean,
well, I mean, it's funny because it's a lot of it. The center of the geopolitical world that was there was the Mughal Empire. That, I mean, we only know in European history as the British defeated them, and that's it. And the kind of legacy of the Persian miniatures, say for instance, in contemporary art forms that were brought over from Western Asia through the Mughal Empire and then up into the Stan countries, and that was a great area of influence. And that's where Islamic culture traveled as well, along that whole aspect of the Mughal Empire. And that to me is something that's incredibly overlooked as well. And it doesn't factor into the stories that you hear very much about this area. It's, as Angus said, right? There's Russia, there's China, there's India, and then there's this black hole, right? That's the Stan countries.
So speaking of books that might touch on Western China that are available in translation, so full disclosure, that one with the map I was mentioning, that's another ACA book actually. It's called the English title is The Will to Walk. So it's by Lei Diansheng, this guy who's set a Guinness record doing that walking. It's a bit of a strange guy, to be honest. it's hard to. I guess when he's describing these places, he's not necessarily got an agenda, but it's definitely all sort of through his eyes. If there is an agenda, it's maybe the fact that he's chosen the Chinese nation to go around, but saves you crossing borders, and it's a long journey. So no need to read too much into that, I guess. I don't think he meets any Kazakhs, but he does go through. I mean, I think it's more probably in the West, the cultures and the history that come up more are the Tibetan people and the Mongols. But it is there, and it's interesting.
Well, earlier in the 1980s, you had the Chinese author Ma Yuan, who was well known for his stories about Tibet, because he was one of the first in the 1980s to kind of wander his way into Tibet and then write stories about Tibet. And some of these are part of the Xianfeng Wenxue, the avant-garde movement that was there in the mid to late 80s. He kind of disappears from the scene, but those are interesting takes without an overt agenda, certainly.
I can see time is still marching on. We've hit, at least in our call, we've hit about the 2-hour mark. So I'm going to let you guys take a nice deep exhalation, relax, because we're going to go for some more lighthearted questions. So first one, it's the word of the day. Can you guys, do you guys have a Chinese or Kazakh word of the day that you could recommend for the listeners for this episode?
I'll admit I didn't think too hard about it. So I don't know if I have a word of the day.
Well, Jack, do you want to go first?
I could scream if that would go with the word of the day when somebody says it.
Wait, you want to scream? Why?
Do you know the reference?
I've forgotten.
I'm dating myself now. This is 80s, 90s television show for kids. Pee Wee Herman and his wacky, weird, wild.
I'm afraid I'm not North American.
Oh, yeah. Well, every time there was a word of a day, and as soon as the word of the day was said by anyone, great klaxons would go brrr, and everybody would go nuts when they said the word of the day. It's probably on YouTube now.
I'm gonna steal that, but I'm gonna use like the Chinese gong.
Yeah. Well, that's what it was. It was this great big thing that came down. I think, if I remember correctly, it was like this big horn that would go, "Arr!" And then everybody would just lose their marbles for a brief moment as the word of the day was said.
Right. Well, you are not allowed to do that. Sorry.
Just out of not trying to hurt anyone's ears listening on headphones.
Yeah.
I've got a word of the day. I did a Kazakh one and a Chinese one. Is that okay?
Yeah.
You're not going to cut me off halfway through?
I might, but not right now.
It depends which words of the day it is. So the Kazakh one is, I mean, again, excuse my pronunciation, is Koychy. Which in Chinese, Li Juan rendered it as huāngyě. I'm reading out of the glossary here in the back of the book. So it's a versatile exclamation, often meaning no way, no thanks, get out, leave it out, and any number of other things similar to that. Because it's used so much in the book, in Winter Pasture. There are whole sections where it's maybe 12 Koychis in a row when, like, for example, Kama, the daughter, is not wanting to do something, and she's like, Koychy, 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 Koychy. And I don't know how you would say it and what the tone would be, but it's everywhere.
I misread it as I was going through. I thought it was supposed to mean something like stupid. Like, I don't know, I have memories of saying something stupid around a Chinese friend and they want to dismiss it, so they just go like, shazi or something. Like, I got at least the impression it was something you use if something like is just ridiculous and you want to dismiss it. But yeah, it's quite charming. I remember the kids seem to use it quite a lot, if I remember right.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm no expert, but I don't feel like that interpretation is far wrong, to be honest, from some of the uses. It feels pretty malleable phrase. And yeah, it's brilliant. It's quite a lot of fun to shout as well. I now use it at home to everyone's amusement. And then the Chinese one is huāngyě. So huang and ye. So huang meaning, I guess, like, I actually don't know what the word on its own means. Like, it's often used in like emptiness or absurdity, like huāngtān. And the word anyway together. Huāngyě means wilds or wilderness. Yeah, meaning
Right.
wilds. Huang kind of meaning large and empty and desolate. And that's how she refers to where they live. It was a long conversation to decide how to translate that word.
Cool. That's a character I'm going to have to teach myself. The Huang one sounds cool.
Ah!
Klaxon. Wow, wow, wow.
Sorry, just had to get that in. I've been waiting with bated breath just to get in that go crazy.
Angus
is looking angrily at us both on the camera.
Oh no. I'm on Google Translate. I just realized I think I've seen Huang before. Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide it's the same Huang, Huang Chao. So something like Wild Wave or Chaotic Wave or something is the Chinese title. So I had seen it before.
Yeah, it's a neat character, and you can there's some versions of it where it has the yan, the spoken form for language in front of it as well. So different connotations. Like there's a Taiwanese writer who wrote this great short story called huāngyě, so wilderness, and it's this nature writing of observations of being out in wilds or the uncultivated land, I suppose you could call it, type of thing.
Cool. Okay, next silly question. Feel free to add your sound effects. If each book was a drink, be this a hard, soft, hot, or cold drink, what would it be? 2 rules here. One is a kind rule, one is a prohibitive rule. So prohibitive rule first. You can't say it's a very strong coffee. You can't say it's a cocktail of lots of different things, because that's just too easy. The kind rule is if you're stuck, you can say a food.
Why not a very strong coffee? You took it straight out of my mouth.
Because everyone says that.
Oh, really? Do they?
It's a very peaty single malt whiskey, preferably, from some small distillery up in Scotland in the Highlands. Really peaty, really dark, really, flavorful, and you can't have ice. You can add a little dash of water to circulate the flavors, but nothing more than that. And maybe 1 or 2 fingers, and that would be it. And it's something that you sip and allow the flavor to kind of explode over your tongue. So I don't have a specific one, but that's where I would put this in Barfield.
I like that choice.
Yeah. What about Winter Pasture there? Because I didn't specify. You both got different books to represent. Would Winter Pasture be a cold drink, like a milkshake or something?
Well, actually, I was thinking it would be. So what I wrote was hot cocoa or hot chocolate, depending on where you are, because even though the elements are harsh in the book and they're really against it a lot of the time, the reading of the book, you got to feel pretty smitten with yourself if you're sat on a nice comfy chair reading about the hardships of Li Juan kind of freezing her fingers and being not reveling in them, but just happy at the fact that you're maybe not out there freezing as well. And there is a sweetness to Li Juan as well, especially with her sense of humor. So maybe there'd be a sprinkling of small marshmallows in there that you kind of get occasionally in the odd mouthful.
Yeah, and they'd be the same color as the spray painted cat, I guess.
Yes, bright red.
Yeah, I should probably say for any readers who don't want to read or to come across descriptions of a cat being like flung around a room and made to dance and stuff, you may wish to avoid Winter Pasture.
Yeah, that's been the main, when I've talked to people about it or seen discussions about it online, that's the main, not bugbear of people, but the point of distaste, really, and completely understandable. Especially, I think, as well, because of how she describes the person who inflicts this suffering upon the cat, which is Tuma, who's a drunk. But she has a lot of respect for him at the same time and considers him a bit of like a buffoon, but in a jokey way, as opposed to calling him a buffoon because he's committing evils. And yeah, her description, she's not harsh enough about him, is kind of the general consensus, I think, when he's doing such things to cats, which is definitely true. But I think she's unsure how to think about him, maybe. I don't know. I'm not decided.
My feeling is just, if you want to read translated literature rather than like a China book written by a Westerner, whatever shape of Westerner it might be, if you're wanting to get something from another culture, it's a bit stupid to like want to have your cake and eat it. So to read something from another person from another culture, but never encounter anything that makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And yeah, like it might, maybe someone might get mad at me for saying treatment of animals is cultural differences and not something objective, but definitely people's attitudes towards how to treat animals, it's not uniform across the world. Like, yeah, I've seen people in China who love their pet cat or their pet dog, but aren't adverse to like dangling it by its front legs and shit, stuff like that. It's just, that's reality.
Especially out in the countryside.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens in the UK still now, in like mainland Europe too.
Right.
If you live in a farming area, an agricultural area, the relationship with animals is so different.
Yeah. Like farmers in the UK love their collie dogs, but they don't cuddle them and put them in little hats and stuff.
Well, I remember going to my mum's hometown years and years ago, and this is a small island off the coast of Newfoundland, and being struck by the fact that a cat had a litter, and they took the kittens and wrapped it in a bag and threw it in the water and let it sink because she don't want all these kittens, So it's definitely not uniform. And when I think part of the point of reading translated literature is, I mean, you almost want to be a little unsettled in places, or at least disorientated in places, because that's the whole point of reading translated literature. I mean, to see different perspectives and different points of view and so on. That's what makes it interesting. I bought for my mom for Christmas a subscription to Asymptote magazine, the book club, and she's got 3 books, and the first one was an Italian that the name escapes me right now, but it's this kind of philosophical meditation of this guy who buggers off up into the mountains, and then when he comes down, society has collapsed and there's nobody around, and he's ruminating on all of these things. And my mom was like, I don't know about this one. This one seems a little bit, but she read it, and that's the whole point. It's to read these translated literatures that maybe don't fit with your expectations necessarily, and that's part of the joy, I think, of reading these types of things.
For sure, yeah. Well, we're getting to the last miscellaneous question. It's the self-promo slot. So I guess, Christopher, you've been through this before with me. But yeah, if you guys have got anywhere you'd like to direct the listeners to your own work or presences online, go for it. So bearing in mind, we are recording this on 21st of February, but it'll be coming out probably sometime March.
I have a very minimal digital presence, so nothing really to direct people to. At that time, I will leave it. I don't really have much by way of self-promotion, other than I'm currently in Toronto.
You've got some other translations that are out there, I guess. I mean, we did one on the show before, Empires of Dust.
Yeah, there are options. I think some of them are mentioned on my university page, but other than that, I don't go on Twitter and stuff, so I'm a little bit analog, I suppose. But so I mean, Jack, go ahead, please.
Everyone who uses Twitter is very jealous of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose I can direct you to my Twitter. It's not something I've ever done before. But Jack D. Hargreaves, if you are at all interested. I mainly retweet Chinese literature-related things or translated literature-related things, express very little of my own opinion. So if you're looking for a news source without a voice, come to me. No translations coming out immediately, but around about now, when the episode is out, Paper Republic, which Eric Abrahamson, previous guest, was the founder of, or is the founder of, and I'm a member of, and put together some activities for. We have Sunday Sentence out at the moment. I mean,
oh yeah, I like
come
those.
join in. I mean, also, just if you haven't been on the site yet, have a look at the site, because there might be a few things freshly up. But we've got a new season of Sunday Sentence up, which is a translation game. So if you speak a bit of Chinese and you want to try your hand at translation, everyone jumps in on the comments for that week's sentence and has a go at translating and then talks about it. And right now we're doing, right now in the future.
Is it from a kid's book?
This time it was kids' book, but by the time this episode comes out, it will be sentences from the 4 classics. And then after that, we're going to do sentences from 4 modern classics. And then after that, there's going to be a season of just kind of contemporary sentences. So depending on what your Chinese, if you've never done classical Chinese before, then you could wait a second. But I guess like Sangguo Yanyi is maybe doable anyway.
Or you could be like Ezra Pound and just, invent meanings from it.
We actually had, in the first series we did for, I can't remember whose sentence it was, was it Eileen Chang or was it Wang Anyi? A French translator who doesn't speak Chinese came in and added her own translation just based off everyone else's translations, and it was a really good translation, but obviously she has no knowledge of Chinese, which she admitted to. But yeah, I mean, if you don't speak any Chinese, come on ahead and just rewrite other people's stuff.
I've been teaching a little bit on Ezra Pound, and then the early days of Cathay and stuff, it was all translations of translations of translations and stuff. And he looked at East, right? The character of East, and broke it up. It's the man, the tree, and the sun. So it's a man standing in front of a tree with the sun coming up behind them. Hence you get East, because that's where the sun rises. And you're kind of like, okay, I kind of see where you're going with this, but I don't think that's where the character came from. But, I guess in this weird Poundian way of imagist poetry and stuff, there is a certain logic that's there. And then when I have a lot of exchange students from China who were not familiar with Pound, and then they're all like, this is unbelievable. Like, wow, I never thought East was that. And then they're all like, this is totally accurate. And I'm like, it's not, right? Like, you do realize Ezra Pound was imagining these things, but it's funny how all those things circulate.
I mean, it's scary how much that still happens now. I can't remember the guy's name, but there's a translator who's translated like the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching, and speaks not a word of either Sanskrit, or which I think the Bhagavad Gita was Sanskrit, wasn't it, or classical Chinese, and still has many translations out, which are sold quite widely, and it's very questionable.
Well, this course that I teach is classical Chinese and English translations, so that's what we look at, is all of these types of things. And it's far out. I mean, some of the history of these translations. The French Jesuits were called that started to translate the I Ching. They were figurists, at least that's what they were named as afterwards. And they actually believed that the I Ching was the whole writ, that it explained the Trinity, the Gospels, and all of that. Never, forgetting conveniently that it's 2,000 years prior to the birth of Jesus, but that's what they were like, because of course Christianity was the only religion and it predates itself, etc., etc. And you're kind of like, wow. I mean, was opium there in China at that time when they were there? Or absinthe. That could be another a drink to describe the books. Absinthe. Chasing the Green Dragon.
That's come up a few times. I'm not quite banning that one yet. But I think if someone says absinthe, I'm going to start saying, no, pick another really strong.
Well, my peaty whiskey. We'll leave it with that.
Peaty whiskey was good.
Yeah. Okay. We finished the miscellaneous questions. Now we're getting on to the further reading questions. So if our listeners want to read more along similar lines, where should they look? And we don't have to restrict ourselves to Chinese lit here. Could be anything. We've name dropped a few books already, but do you guys want to name drop any more?
Yeah. Do they have to? I suppose best if they're in English, right?
Yeah, although we do have Chinese speaking and Chinese listeners, so it wouldn't be too crazy to recommend something you can only get in Chinese.
I mean, I hope that this book is in English in the future. I've written down two. One is in Chinese, and hopefully we'll get translations from him soon, and the other's English. But Liu Liangcheng, who is also based in Xinjiang, also a Han writer. Is he Han? I think he is. And he's got a village of one, so 一个人的村庄, which is very similar to Winter Pasture in many ways. It's him in his village in Xinjiang, and just talking about the animals around him, talking about life, lots of isolation, lots of loneliness, lots of kind of really personifying the nature about him, maybe a little bit more animism than Li Juan, but really good stuff. Highly recommended. And then in English, a book out from Daunt Books, which was originally out in 1976, called The Solace of Open Spaces by Gretel Ehrlich. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. But a woman moves to vast farming territory in the States, and it's her kind of memoir description of that. So lots of similarities, lots of crossover.
Okay, Christopher.
First for in English, a Canadian author, Margaret Lawrence, not Atwood, the other Margaret that writes in. She's got this great novel called The Stone Angel, which is about this really, it's an older woman, a stubborn older woman who's had this extraordinary life on the prairies. So the farming area of Canada, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan area. And she's this hard-willed woman that kind of echoes, I think, Li Juan's mom to some extent. And this very powerful character. And it's a great story. So that would be one for an English. And a Chinese one, a Taiwanese author by the name of Huāngyě, who's not been translated, but he has this series called the Historical Fantasy. So I think it's 5 or 6 books that kind of retells the history of Taiwan through narrative stories that kind of reinterpret some of the Aboriginal history. And one of the volumes, I think there's 6 in total. One of the volumes is about Koychy or Zhengzhonggong, the half Japanese pirate prince of the late Ming, early Qing period. And then there's another one that talks about the Aboriginal peoples in Taiwan, the existence of the Xiaoai Ren, or the little people. So that's a great series by Huāngyě. That
sounds incredible.
And explores different aspects of lived history in Taiwan, and it even brings in like a British, I think he's a British missionary adventurer who travels along on bits of the railroad on one of those little push railroad carts that he has a servant do it, and he sits on top. Real fellow, actually, historical fellow. So that's the interesting bit, is that these are based on real history, and then kind of creatively interpreted. Like one is this Japanese ethnographer, Mori Ushinosuke, who he did ethnographical studies on the Taiwanese Aboriginal peoples, and he was trying to promote greater protection for Aboriginal peoples. And of course, the Japanese Empire, once the imperialization policy, the Kominka or Huangminhua, started partway through their colonial period, then everybody had to be Japanized. And so he jumps off, he sails back to Japan and jumps off the boat, and he's never seen again. That's the real person. But Huāngyě takes this, actually, he jumps off the boat and swims back to Taiwan, and then joins up with this Aboriginal tribe and lives the rest of his life there. And that's kind of an interesting story as well.
My own recommendation is these are both books written in English. Neither of them are really that close to either of Li Juan's books, but they kind of different from particular angles, I think they remind me of Lee Juan's writing. One is The Liars Club by Mary Carr, which is probably the best sort of memoir book I've ever read. Probably it's only really got two things in common with Lee Juan's books. One is it's very idiosyncratic. You can tell Mary Carr's got a strong personality and a slightly unconventional journey through life. And two is she has a very strange mother, and she writes a lot about her. So there's that. And the other one is, maybe this one's a bit more out there, but have either of you read Going Solo by Roald Dahl, his memoir of like his young adulthood?
No, I haven't.
That's a really interesting book. I think it's maybe overshadowed a bit by his book Boy, about being a boy. Going Solo is basically everything after high school, but he gets thrown right into the thick of it because he goes off to Africa, where he's working for the Shell company, but imperialism being what it is, it's basically a British Empire outpost, and he's there when World War II kicks off. So, and then he ends up going around on like the Mediterranean sort of campaigns. So he's in a lot of arid environments, maybe a little bit like Distant Sunflower Fields. And again, he's an outsider from, well, maybe not an empire, but he's from like the sort of the dominant power there. It's not that, he's from the dominant power and he's in various foreign lands. And maybe again, like Lee Juan, maybe I'm reaching here, but again, like Lee Juan, he's got a fairly strong personality, goes his own way and so on. So yeah, those are my recommendations. Very last question. What are you guys reading now?
I'm reading the Cairo trilogy by Mahfouz, the epic tale translated some years ago from the Arabic about Egypt in the early 20th century and this family history. So it's along the lines of those, big trilogy books. You've got Chinua Achebe's African trilogy. I think I might have mentioned it in the event a couple of weeks ago. I'm reading the Cairo trilogy now.
Right, the Cairo. I misheard you and put the Pyro trilogy.
Cairo trilogy.
All right, so it's not a fantasy novel about people who can shoot
fire. No,
but
that sounds fun. And I'm actually rereading Ernest Fenollosa's the Chinese ideogram as a source for poetry. There's some years ago, what's his name, Han Saucy, and a couple other people. Lucas Klein was involved with it. They redid Ernest Fenollosa's essay as Pound redid it, and they have this kind of annotated edition that came out. That's it's fascinating reading, actually. And they have the essay with how Pound published it, and then they have the essay minus Pound, and then you have all these annotations about all these crazy stories, how they got the characters and what the characters mean. So that's kind of fun reading.
And Jack, what are you reading just now?
I mean, Christopher just said it actually. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. I'm reading at the moment. My first time I've read anything by him, and really enjoying it. And yeah, I mean, that is, I guess, in a similar way to Winter Pasture, although obviously Things Fall Apart is an absolute classic. A look into a culture and a way of life that, at least for me, is quite is very new, very foreign. And then also, just to give an independent press a shout out, This Paradise, the short story collection by Ruby Cowling from Boiler House Press, from like their latest series of books, doing really interesting things with the short story, making stories out of things you might not expect to be able to make a story.
Well, that's me all out of questions, so I'll just say thank you both for coming. I can't say coming along because we're in a Zoom room, but thanks for coming on the show. It's a very fun chat, and I feel like I'm a little bit wiser about Lee Juan and our books. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So that is the end of the show, and our very last thing, you'll know this all off by heart by now, it's the ending plugs. So I'll try and get through these speedily. So the first one is the mailing list. Once I hit 50 subscribers on this, I'll start sharing blogs or thoughts or behind the scenes on the show. For now, it's just updates of when new episodes come out. But yeah, that is the TrChFic mailing list. There will be a link for that in the show notes and on the show's homepage at TrChFic.podbean.com. TrChFic being TrChFic. If you want to support the show tangibly, which means with money, and also if you want to enjoy bonus content like an episode which is just 22 minutes of me breaking down the cover of the new Journey to the West book, translated by Julia Lovell, or me ranting about robots and gender, a popular topic in my preamble for the episode I'm going to do on the membranes by TrChFic, that's all up behind a mightily high $1 a month paywall on Patreon. Although, of course, you can give more if you want to make me. The show's social media. So there's 3 of them. You probably know this off by heart. There's Instagram at TrChFic, or TrChFic. That's a good place to not be driven insane by Twitter, and also to get in touch. If you do want to be driven insane by Twitter, it's at Angus Likes Words. That's where you can find me. You will generally find me not expressing my opinions on Twitter. If you want to join the show's Discord and talk to fans, like-minded individuals, there's an invite to our Discord server in the show notes. Now, the best thing you can do for the show is telling people, I think, spreading the word. So tell your teacher, tell your friend, and tell all the animals, the chickens, the dogs, the little bunny rabbits, the goats, and the sunflowers, even though they're not animals. Tell them all. If you're not on the Xinjiang steppe, then maybe just tell your cat, but don't spray paint it and don't throw it around the room, because that's morally wrong. Please remember that, and catch you again next time on the next episode. So until then, 再见.